So to get things started, we're going to begin with a scene that's about as simple as they come. We have a plane and a teapot. There's really nothing special about the materials that are on these either. The plane has just a regular standard, nothing tweaked at all shader on it. And the teapot has just a slight blue tint. Otherwise it's a standard material with nothing in it. I have added a little bit of specular to it though. So first thing we're going to do is let's just render this and see what it looks like. Alright, so that is our masterpiece right there that we're going to actually break into passes and composite back together. So this is going to be our ultimate end goal. We'll render out different passes and recreate this. So let's go ahead and we'll start doing that. To render out passes with the scanline render, you're going to open up the render dialog and go to this render elements tab. We're going to make the elements active and we want to see them, so let's display them. And let's take a look at what elements we can have. So here's a big list of all the different types of passes we can render out. A lot of these we don't need for such a simple scene, so we're only going to deal with a few of these right now. But the whole idea behind compositing is that you're going to want to decide what elements you want to have control over later on when you composite, and then make sure that you render out all the passes that you need in order to have that control. So one that is almost always used is going to be the diffuse. This is just the color properties of the materials, anything that's in the diffuse slot basically. Let's see, we want lighting and shadow and specular. Now let's see if there's anything else here. We don't really have any self-illumination, there's no reflections, no separate IDs, no hair. The alpha channel we'll get for free. It comes just, whenever you save this out, you get that one for free. So don't need to worry about this. And I think will do it for this scene. So we hit OK. And then one thing to notice is we've got these controls down here for at least some of these. For the diffuse, we have the option of having lighting on or off, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. For lighting, you can have direct light on, indirect, shadows, okay. Shadows, no options for that, and specular, no options. Alright, so let's go ahead and we'll render these passes out. So we'll hit render. This slows down a little bit. It's computing all those other passes at the same time. And here they are. So here's our specular. This is our shadow. Shadow passes always show up in the alpha channel. So your RGB channel should be black and the shadow is in your alpha. Here's just the lighting. Now this is without any of the diffuse information on the models at all. This is basically just putting a white shader on everything and having just the light. And here's our diffuse. You can see that it's got the shading from the light on it, but no shadows. So that's what that little lighting checkbox does. So it's got the shading in it. Alright, so now we're going to want to do this again, but actually save those out. So what I'll do is put in my output path, and we'll just call this teapot, save it as a targa. I'm going to talk about this stuff later on. This is really important, but for now we're just going to use these settings. 32-bit, which basically just means we're going to have the alpha channel stored. Compressed, just saving some size on the hard drive, and pre-multiplied alpha. This one's really important also, but we'll get into what this means and how to deal with it later. Alright, so we have an output path. Now if we go back to the elements and select one of these guys, you'll notice that it put in the path right here. So here's into the background, specular on top, and it's there. Let's see. Okay, it's there, but it looks a little bit strange, and the reason for that is that your specular paths should be additive. And another thing we should notice is if you go and look at the alpha channel is the same as the RGB, or at least visually it's the same. But we don't want an alpha channel with our specular. So what we want to do is get rid of the alpha, and we do that by turning down the alpha gain. What this is doing is basically, if we look at an image with an alpha, if this is all the way to 1, and remember we're not affecting this pass right here, but if this is at 1, then you have this image. And as you turn this down, it's taking anything that's white and just making it black. So that's what we've done to our specular alpha, even though we can't see it here, but in the merge we're turning it down to nothing. And then what makes it additive is this little slider right here, which you can see it's set to additive right now, but you can also have it set to subtractive, which in this case does nothing. But anything like a specular pass or lighting should always be done with additive blend modes. Alright, so there we go, and we're not really needing this pass, so we'll just kind of leave it off to the side. Thought maybe we need it, but turns out we don't. So let's take a look at our control image, and alright, so we've obviously got a problem here with the shadow. If we look at the specular pass, it doesn't have the shadow in there, so what we need to do is mask that out. And we can do that because we have the shadow pass. So what I'll do is I can just take the shadow pass, plug it right into this little blue triangle, which is the mask input. And as you can see, it masked it, but it's putting it in the white area of our shadow pass, which makes sense, but we need that inverted. So if you select the merge, go to this little radioactive tab, you can apply mask inverted. So there we go, fixed. So if we compare the original render with the composite, you can see that they're identical. Or are they? Let's actually zoom in here and take a look at what's going on. Take a look at this edge right here. We've got this weird bright little halo that's going all the way around our object, at least in the shadow parts it's visible. So, alright, it's not there in the render out of max, but we have it here. And actually, if you look right here on the handle, we have a problem there too. Alright, so what happened? I mean, we have 3 passes. This isn't a super complicated comp. You know, what caused this problem here? Well, if we take a look at the diffuse pass, you see this area right here, it's all lit up. The reason it's lit up is because we don't have shadows on our diffuse pass. We're putting the shadows on later. And if we take a look at the alpha channel, you see, well, the edges of this are a little strange, but the real problems are occurring right along here and right along here. That's where we're getting those edges showing through. And why is that happening? Well, once again, if we go back to the alpha channel, you'll see we've got white, which is fine. That means that those areas are going to be totally black once the shadow's put on top, and that's correct. But we have this little edge, and this edge was, anti-aliased, and so it has these grayscale values. So what that means is that these are partially transparent pixels. So if we look at the diffuse, these values aren't black, which they need to be in order to get the correct result. They have this blue tint color, and so when we put the black shadows on top with the partially transparent edges, it's letting some of that color show through and creating that edge. And if we put the specular on, you see it just got a little bit brighter. Let me do it again. We have the same problem with the specular, because here's our specular pass, and this area again should be completely in shadow. We shouldn't have any specular there. And it doesn't, we're using the same shadow alpha for a mask, which has those transparent pixels, and so we get this ugly little edge. So, that's kind of a bummer. So how do we fix that? Well, to tell you the truth, these passes right here will never go back together and look like this. It's just not going to happen. Turns out that the default values in Max are not set up to give you the correct result. So what we need to do is go back into Max and figure out what combination is going to give us the correct results. So let's go back and look at some of those options that we had with these passes. Now, we can do the lighting pass with the shadows on, which we did. And we have lighting that we can turn on or off in the diffuse. And this is probably going to get us closer. Because remember, we have that lighting pass, and it has shadows in it, and it doesn't have that little problem here because that area is in shadow. So let's go ahead and try rendering out the diffuse pass without having the lighting in it. So I'm just going to render this and overwrite the old one. Okay, so those all rendered. Now let's take a look. Here's our diffuse pass, and so this has all the lighting information completely removed, and all we have is just the color. Alright, so let's go back, and what I'm going to do is we still have the old pass loaded into memory, so I'm just going to reload that pass. And now we're going to need to bring in our lighting pass. So there's the diffuse, there's the light, so we'll put a merge on here. You can just bring it down and then see how it changes the colors of the little connection. You just drag and drop and it will put it on there for you. So we'll connect this up, and then for this sort of situation, what you do is you multiply. So I'm going to switch this over to multiply, and now we have just the lighting information. And also the shadows are in there. So we don't need shadows anymore. We can pull that off of there. So we've got it taken care of in this lighting pass. And then we'll put the specular on. We're still going to need to mask the specular because it wasn't set up with shadows. And let's see. It's still there. You can just make it out. See the difference? Alright, so we're not there yet. That didn't solve it. We need to get the same results as we had in the lighting pass, where this is all in shadow and we don't have any anti-aliasing or light coming in there. And so to do that, we need to go back into Max and create some new elements. Alright, let's start over. Let's get rid of this stuff. These weren't really cutting it. We will end up reusing some of those passes we already rendered, but let's make some new ones. What other passes do we have that might work? What is this guy? Blend. Let's take a look at blend. Blend is really interesting. It allows you to choose what sort of elements you want to have in one single pass. And this is great. Look, it's got diffuse, specular, shadows. Those are all the things we need. So let's go ahead and we'll just get rid of some of this stuff. We're going to want the shadows and we're going to want the diffuse. That will give us our diffuse pass with shadows. So let's keep that. We'll call it diff shadow, and put that here as well for the output. Let's create another one, and we'll call this one spec shadow. Alright, and for that one we want just the specular with the shadows. So let's go ahead and render that out. Okay, and here's the result. Alright, perfect. See, now we've got the shadows in our specular pass, and that area is completely occluded now, so it's dark, so we should be good on that one. And the diffuse, this looks exactly like it did with our diffuse and lighting pass combined, and that's exactly what this is. So we've saved these out, so let's go back, take a look. We'll bring these in, and let's take a look at them. Here's our diffuse with shadow blend pass, and it's identical to our lighting and diffuse pass that were multiplied together. So those are identical. And then we have the specular pass with the shadows. So let's just pull this out, and we'll bring in a new merge, connect this up, and remember this needs to be set to additive, 0 alpha gain. And now, have we done it? Let's take a look. Alright, they're identical now. So the lesson here is that you really need to figure out what passes and how to combine them to really get the correct output. Now, that little edge there probably would not have been a really big deal in a still image. You could have easily painted that out, but in animation, when this is moving around and motion blurred, that is just going to be exaggerated and look terrible. So you need to know how to break this stuff up so that it actually goes back together properly, and do not trust the default values. Now, this is probably a good moment to bring up another point. For this scene, remember when we hit render and got that beauty pass straight out of max, this one, the teapot just by itself pass, that took us all of 5 seconds to get that pass. To actually break all this stuff out, even if we had done it right the first time, it took longer than 5 seconds to reassemble all this stuff. Now, it didn't take very long, so it's kind of not the best example, but consider this in a much larger project. If you're able to get the results you want straight out of max without compositing, then there's really no need to break the stuff out. You're just slowing yourself down. So there comes this point in a project where you need to know whether it's actually going to be faster to break this stuff out and put it back together, and then be able to make little tweaks to it and changes in real time while you're compositing. If that's going to be faster ultimately than just going into max, tweaking the color of a light or something and rendering that back out. Another point actually to talk about is we put this back together again exactly the way it is out of 3D Studio, so what's the point of even doing that? The whole idea behind compositing is that you can change things and make it look the way you want it to look easier. Well, I think it's really good to understand how these passes actually go back together properly. I mean, that little edge that we had there may not have been a huge deal right here, but something like that is just going to come back and haunt you later in a bigger project you want to render out. So we'll turn on elements, we want to display them. Alright, we'll want the diffuse and the lighting, and we've got specular. Now, one thing to take a look at here, remember that trick we did for with the blend material, or with the blend element, that we could get the shadows into our specular? Let's do that right now, because obviously we're going to have that problem again if we don't. And finally, reflection. Okay, though there's no options for reflection, but let's go ahead and change this to spec shadow. And we'll put that in here. Okay. And then let's make sure we get this set up right. And we should be good. So let's go ahead and render out the passes. Okay, so here's our passes. We have the reflection pass, the lighting pass, our diffuse pass, and a specular with the shadows in it. Alright, so let's go ahead and we'll jump over into Fusion next, and we'll put that stuff back together. Alright, so let's bring those passes in. We'll just drag and drop. Okay, so once again, here's the control image. And let's start combining these passes up. So what we'll do is we've got our lighting pass, which we multiply over top of the diffuse. Okay, and then what you do with reflections is they're additive. So let's go ahead and just bring in another merge, and we'll set this one to additive. Okay, so there we have reflections, and again, also with with the specular, those are also additive. So there we go. We've done the correct compositing setup here. So let's compare it with our control. Okay. Obviously, it got darker, so there's something that is not correct here. Now, what is it? It turns out it's not a problem with the reflection pass. It's actually a problem with the diffuse pass. What should be happening, and it's what other renderers do, is it'll take the reflections that are on your materials and it'll kind of use that to darken down your diffuse color. And it does that so that when you go back and you add the reflection pass back on, that you end up getting the correct result. So what we need to do is figure out why that didn't happen in 3D Studio. So let's jump back into Max and take a look at how to get the diffuse pass to turn out right. Alright, so back in Max, let's look at the diffuse pass here. Alright, the only option that we have is lighting. So let's turn that on and let's just see if we render that, what does that do for our diffuse pass? Does it help us in any way? So I'll do a test render. Alright, so let's look at what happened with the diffuse pass. Okay, check it out. Now it's darkening the material the way it's supposed to. This is correct. But what happened was, now we've got the shading on this teapot. And, well, we didn't really want that to happen, but we're kind of stuck with that, to tell you the truth. I mean, we only have the option of on or off, and if on corrects our reflections, then we're going to have to composite this differently. So I'm thinking what's going to work best here is maybe we turn this into a lighting pass. You know, let's get rid of the diffuse and the light that were separate passes, and let's just combine them. So what we'll do is, instead of using the diffuse with lighting, what I want to instead use is the blend again, but this time we're going to call it diff shadow, which is our diffuse pass with shadows. Right, and so we want the diffuse, apply shadows. Alright, let's try rendering this out now. Okay, so here it is. Now we've got the diffuse with the shadows, reflections. We don't need lighting anymore, but I forgot to turn it off. And the specular with the shadows. So let's go back into Fusion now, and we'll bring in our new pass. Okay, now let's take a look. We're basically going to use this pass to replace this pass. So let's get that stuff out of there, and we'll just connect this up. And now if we compare these two, now they're identical. Okay, so what if you really had your heart set on working this way, where you've got these extra passes and therefore extra control, and because we were forced to render with the shading in the diffuse pass in order to get the reflections right, we've lost that control. How do you get it back? Well, it's possible, but it starts to get fairly complex. So we're going to kind of jump ahead to something fairly advanced here, but I just want you to see that it is possible, and hopefully it will make sense what's happening. But let's just look at what we've got here. Alright, here is the diffuse full bright lighting multiplied together. Alright, that's what we get, those two passes together. Now the new pass we created, the only difference between these two passes is that we get that darkening that's happening in there. And because we're able to isolate just that darkening, that's the only thing that's different between these, we can actually separate this out and use it a little bit differently. So the way you do that is you take a channel Boolean, and I'm just going to make a copy of that pass and bring it over here. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect these two together, and I'm going to go into the channel Boolean, and we have this operation here, and there's a bunch of different things we can do. Most of them are kind of math related, like divide, which is what we're going to do. We're going to divide every pixel value by the pixel value of the other pass. So I'll set that to divide. I don't want the alpha to change at all, so we're only affecting the red, green, and blue channels. Alpha's not doing anything. And look what we got. We got that gradient. So ignore all of the kind of weird little pixels we got there. They're actually not really a problem for us. What's important is that we got this gradient. So what we can do with that is we can kind of go back here and kind of combine these in a different way. Let's take this pass, right, and let's make a copy of it. Bring it over here. And then what we can do is, let's pull the old pass out of the way. We can multiply these together, right? All we did was divide before, so to put it back we just multiply. So if we change our blend mode here to multiply, now we're kind of, now we're getting that gradient that's happening in there. We still have our full bright stuff, so let's pull this out. Oops, don't want to do that. Let me go back. Let's copy this out, paste it in here, right? And now the lighting goes over top, and now again it matches the control image, but we have the ability to change our lighting now. So there you go. That's how you get that extra control back. It requires rendering the one extra pass, this one, and if you work with it in kind of a crazy way here, you can go back to having that extra control with this pass. Otherwise, that's a lot of work, and if you really don't need the control over this pass, then just render it like this. But if you really wanted to, you could, and that's the point. So